Is that a rooster?
Yeah, sorry, we
Okay.
live out in the country. We have a few roosters.
No, that's great. Okay, I was just interrupted by a rooster, but this is Henry Chamberlain. Welcome to another Comics Grinder interview. Today I've got Jose Alaniz, and we're going to talk about the complete Moscow calling. Thank you, Jose, for doing this chat with me.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm going to do a little rough and ready intro, and then you can correct me, and you can take it from there. But this is the book, and this is
Yeah,
part of the. Am I pronouncing this right? Amatl?
a model is usually the way. Yeah,
Amatl. I'm sorry. Well, I'm Mexican American. I should know, but I'm bad sometimes with words and bad sometimes with names. But anyway, Amatl. This is a
yeah.
comic series. It's an imprint from San Diego State University, and this is the second a contribution you've made to Amatl. I'm going to let you give us like an elevator pitch of whatever you'd like, an introduction to this particular title.
Well, this book took about 30 years to come together, going back to its beginnings in the comic strip that I made when I was living in Russia in the 1990s, working as a journalist, producing this strip on a daily basis for about 9.5 months. And then I would return to Russia every once in a while and restart it here and there. And so I basically just sat on this material. I would add to it. I came up with other sorts of storylines, and I never finished it until this collection, because Amatl Comix, which is an imprint of San Diego State University, has only emerged in the last about 5 years, and they're part of a wave of smaller publishers that are open to publishing work by Latinx authors. And so, yeah, I just kind of sat on it for a long time until someone was willing to put it together. And then I completed the storyline in a little short graphic novella format. I had a bunch of other supplementary material. I had written a novella called Moscow 93, which was also about my time living in Moscow. Pretty autobiographical in many ways. And so I think, let's put all this stuff together. And it all came together. I had a nice interview with Elliot Borenstein, one of my friends, a professor at NYU, who also knows a lot about comics and is also a Russia specialist. Actually, I met him in Moscow back in the 90s, so he could really, I think, judge the work, I think, better than a lot of people, just in terms of the portrait that it paints of Moscow during the Yeltsin years. And then, of course, I couldn't really ignore the war in Ukraine. So that was one of the supplementary book stories that I put in, a story about the siege of Mariupol, which happened just over a year ago in Ukraine, and and just the ways that the Yeltsin years led into the current terrible Putin era. So it's a work that's kind of obviously coming out of my interests in my own life as someone who lived in Russia, and also just the fact that I'm an academic and I live with these questions, and the question of where Russia is going and what it's doing in the world is paramount pretty much all the time in my business.
Yes, of course. I fully appreciate that you love being a cartoonist when you can be a cartoonist. You love being an academic. You have to find a way to juggle both. Of course, your energy and your career as an academic, but at the same time, there's that love for comics. So, thus the book two so far.
Yeah.
And I will not claim to have read this all the way through. I just got this recently. So this is your study of comics that is published by Mississippi University Press of Mississippi. I want to get the name correct. And so what I'd like to do is dabble into this book a little bit and get your thoughts on comics in Russia in general. Plus, well, of course, focus on the book in question. And I am going to switch cameras. And now we have the book.
Wow.
And I have a couple of things I highlighted, which I think will be fun. First, to give people an idea of what the comic strip was like. And this is a continuation of the Phantom Zone that you did at the University of Texas. And then you had that one last semester to complete in Moscow, and that led to you publishing the comic strip in the Moscow Tribune starting in the fall of '93. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I used to call it a sequel to the Phantom Zone. I mean, I realized that that's actually technically incorrect. It's really more of a spin-off. It's taking some of the characters and it's but not all of them. And the main character Pepe is the cousin of the main character in the Phantom Zone. So yeah, it's really should be called a spin-off, I suppose.
Okay, but it has a social satire. It has magical realism. It begins with Pepe talking to a bat, and the bat is a friend, and he appears throughout the comic strip. And
Yeah, Sid the Bat comes out of the fact if you've ever spent time in Austin, Texas, where I went to university, there's a famous bridge there, the Congress Avenue Bridge, that has a colony of bats that lives under it, and you can watch the bats come out, to feed at sunset, and it's one of the wonderful things about living there. And so, yeah, it just kind of as I left as I had finished college, I had left Austin where I had lived for several years, and I guess it was probably Sid is probably a little bit of an emblem of nostalgia for Austin.
well, I also did my own comic strip at University of Houston, which
Oh,
I don't know
cool.
if University of Houston UT really rivals. Or are we friendly rivals? I don't know, but I only had squirrels to play with as a motif, and I had fun with a recurring squirrel character. Um,
Cool. You ought to publish those if you haven't already.
I have dabbled in considered publishing those, but I've actually moved on to a lot of other comic adventures or misadventures, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah,
I have
cool.
a book coming out by Rutgers University Press.
Hmm.
So I had to bite the bullet and say, well, I really want to explore graphic novels. So I kind of it was a bittersweet goodbye to comic strips per se, and I focused in on graphic novels. But
That's great.
I wanted to focus on this little excerpt here, and I believe this is from your novella. This is just to give people a taste, and I don't. Hopefully, I won't butcher this. The models, Ellen says their cheekbones reach up to their temples. I love that line. The Mahdi's, teen proto-ravers who worship Depeche Mode. How true. Mr. First gay newsletter in Russia, in his customary leather jacket and plastic snake wrapped around his neck. Film festival stars and producers, bards and bimbos, middle-aged divas, pubescent sex workers. I'm trying to describe, pardon me, I'm trying to describe post-Baudrillard Babel here. Get it? 20s Chicago. It's been stocked with Uzis and metal detectors entrances and Turkish heroin by way of Azerbaijan and cell phones and stretch limos, modems, remote controlled car bombs, plutonium traffickers, 2,147 rubles per dollar, all in Al Capone land. And here comes the most oft used reporter's boilerplate. Imagine the whole shebang plucked up and airdropped into the middle of the former Soviet Union. I'm sure you heard that over and over again during the Yeltsin years. That boy, this is going to be it's going to be a wild ride. The Soviet Union and capitalism collide.
Well, they called it the Wild East. Yeah. No, that's right. I mean, that I think that you're getting at by quoting that paragraph is just in a way the real challenge that it was to try to describe it to someone who was to what it was like, to describe what it was like living in Moscow at that time to someone who maybe had never been there, and it really is an extraordinary. It was an extraordinary moment. Of course, it was also part of the point of that novella is also just talking about the really colonialist mindset that a lot of the American and Western press corps had, and a lot of just the Western expat community, which numbered around 15,000 at this time in Moscow. give or take. It was a really pretty stark picture of inequality and of presumed entitlement, and especially the men. I got to say, so the novella gets into a lot of that in a very X-rated, I would say, way that the strip, of course, never could get into directly. There's allusions to stuff like that, but in the strip, but in the novella, I can just basically name names a lot more.
Well, I think you mentioned in the intro that it's no surprise that that we transitioned into Putin in a lot of ways, because Yeltsin was corrupt. It was like inevitable, which is so sad. I mean,
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you could say Yeltsin was corrupt, but pretty much every Russian leader has been corrupt in that era. The question was not the corruption. What Yeltsin was trying to do was actually, I think this has been borne out just by the historians, is that he really was interested in modernizing the country and getting it along a more democratic footing. Of course, you had all sorts of Soviet holdovers that was never going to change quickly. But there was a real attempt under Yeltsin to have the country reflect more humanitarian values that we would recognize, to the extent that he was perfectly fine with being mocked in the press. I mean, there was a lot of, obviously, I mean, he was very unpopular by the end of his term. He was in the single digits. But in terms of what people could say, he knew that was an important thing. He really was a reformer in terms of his goals. But very quickly under Putin, right? Very soon after Putin takes over, he starts clamping down on free speech, including reporting of bad news, including especially mockery of him. And that's a very, very different contrast. So sure, they're both corrupt. I mean, corruption is just kind of part of the air you breathe, unfortunately, in that culture. But there were palpable differences. Just ask gay people, right? The 90s were pretty much open. That was one of the most Western aspects of 90s Russia, is that you had a lot of out people. They had just repealed the law against sodomy in the early 90s. One of the figures that I mentioned, like the guy with the first gay newsletter, I'm referring to Amatl Comix, who was a gay rights activist and who was notorious for wearing a black leather jacket. And it was night and day compared to now. Now there are people living in terror, people who are back in the closet. There are laws against so-called gay propaganda, which is construed very, very widely. And so that's one of the big differences you can point to of life under Yeltsin versus life under Putin. Yes, they're both corrupt.
oh well, yeah, of course. I'm gonna just stumble along and ask my questions as best I can. I want to let you have the floor for the most part, but
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you have to pick your battles. I'm more like a amateur academic, and I've been trying to. I've focused a lot of my attentions on writing and comics, more comics than anything maybe. But I do remember reading this one book by Bill Browder,
Uh-huh.
and it's that term when it's Interpol's term when somebody's being he's like the most wanted person, and Bill Browder got on that. I forget what the term is,
Uh-huh.
red alert or something. But anyway, uh, but Bill mentioned some very interesting things, like the whole technique of manufacturing lies. When someone's accused of something, you turn it on them. A very Russian thing. You turn it on them and then some.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that was interesting is Bill talked about how Putin was, well, he was corrupt. I use this umbrella term corrupt, but just incompetent. And even though well-intentioned, there was so much, he was compromised. And the only way out was for him to hand over the reins of power to Putin, which I think there's a lot of truth to that. That's so sad. I mean,
Yes.
we had Gorbachev, and then
Yes.
and we would just assume that things would continue on with Yeltsin, which a very bad assumption.
Well, Yeltsin, yeah, he was very ill, and he was not, in his right mind, and a lot of the time, He was also notoriously had a drinking problem. So no, you're absolutely right that there was a real deal that was crafted really behind the scenes, whereby in a sense Yeltsin granted Putin all sorts of immunity so that in exchange for the power. And of course, officially Putin, of course, is appointed, and then he's eventually elected but president. But that was really the mechanism by which you had that transfer of power. Now that said, right, this isn't happening in a vacuum. Yeltsin was unpopular because you had a tremendous amount of social and economic turmoil. The ruble was devalued a number of times. I remember this, right? Basically, that meant that you had people rushing the banks, desperate to get out their money so that they could spend it before it became worthless, right? And people's life savings were wiped out repeatedly. There was the beginnings of a middle class that would then be, severely compromised. And so you had other examples, things I talk about in the novella, just perceptions of the country falling apart, tremendous inequality, tremendous crime as it was perceived. Although over the course of the 90s, the crime rate in Russia was actually not as bad as some places in the West, but there was the perception that it was all going to hell. And the media was really, really good at spinning these very sensationalist narratives. I think I talk about that in the novella. I mean, there were programs that I guess you could call them reality TV programs that were basically just going around during the day finding car accidents so that you could zoom in on all of the carnage and all of the gore and just basically broadcast it. So there was really no real filters for that sort of thing. Compare that to 70 years of having the media be very, very closely controlled, very, very closely curated by the state, and very sterilized. So for Russians, it was a really profound shock. Pornography was another one, right? The idea that pretty much anything goes. You could go to your local newsstand, there's porn, basically very, very available. All of these things, and again, Putin was actually okay with that sort of thing. He thought it was part of free speech, and frankly, there were other problems. But under Putin, right? Again, so people associate Putin with cracking down on those sorts of excesses and trying to bring order back. It's a lot more complicated. It had a lot more to do with the price of oil, which goes up shortly after Putin is elected, and so there's this perception that these standards of living that go up with Putin were exclusively owing to Putin. It was owing to a number of different factors, but basically, right, Putin is this law-bringing, order-restoring, patriotic figure that makes Russians feel like they are a respectable power, like they are a powerful nation. And sadly, right, we see where that sort of thing is wound up 20-something years later with this war, because and the war's been going on since 2014, of course. And before that, we had the invasion of Chechnya, or the military crackdown in Chechnya, and then the military invasion of Georgia in 2008. So these are all just symptoms of this, in a sense, of a reaction to the sense of humiliation and weakness of the 1990s, this very period that I'm talking about in Moscow Calling.
I'm so happy to just let you have the floor. I wanted to.
Well, I certainly seem to just go on, don't I?
No. I wanted you to maybe comment a little bit about this book, because it's quite the gem. I think you create like a model for exploring comics in any country, because you consider the culture. What is it that makes a country tick? In Russia, you say it's a country that absorbed culture from different areas and really was intense about it. But then when it comes to comics, some academics might say, well, for comics, they were more text focused. The Russians couldn't quite figure out a style and for the life of me, I can't think of any superstar from Russia. There's no Chris Ware coming from Russia, as far as I know.
Well, not in translation, unfortunately. There are some wonderful folks working in comics, but for so long, as I talk about in that book, there just wasn't really an industry. So the 90s, just to go back to the 90s, again, a horrible time for Russian publishing, for Russian, especially comics publishers, but there were a number of people who tried out, and usually these series that would come out would only last a few issues because there was just no way to make it economically viable. There's all sorts of reasons why the Russian reader did not feel comfortable or really felt that comics were a native art form. And so there was a lot of that kind of holdover from previous eras, not just the Soviets, because I think some of those attitudes, logocentric attitudes, really we can trace those back to really the Orthodox Church and its own traditions, and then it really took a long time. The weird thing is that I was joking with someone saying that every time I publish a book, it immediately gets obsolete because pretty much when I published that first book in 2010, and it ends on kind of a glum note. I'm kind of saying, look, I mean, there's these wonderful artists, but there's no industry to support them, and already I'm talking about at the end of that book about how Putin is basically kind of cracking down on a lot of the freedoms that under Yeltsin. It was not as bad, by the way, in the 2000s as it would get after Putin's was inaugurated for the third time in 2012. But anyway, in 2010, I'm basically saying, look, there's kind of no real industry here to support them. But then as soon as I published that, that's when the industry was actually starting to get on its footing in the late 2000s, and certainly by 2010, 2011, when you start getting the Comic Con, like Comic Con Russia, that comes along, a lot more festivals. Comic studies starts coming up. A lot more publishers like Bubble start coming up. And so, yeah, so basically, if you were to read that in 2010, 2011, you'd already have an outdated picture. Then I published the story of the 2010s in my new book from last year, Resurrection, which is about post-Soviet Russian comics, focusing a lot on the Putin years. And I talk about all of that stuff that happened over the last, really since about 2010, where you do have really what is more or less a full-fledged comics industry. There's one big factor, by the way, that contributed to all of that, and that was the success of the Marvel superhero movies, which were watched in the Soviet Union quite assiduously, especially Iron Man and Iron Man 2, which has a Russian villain. And that I think, just demonstrating the success of that, and really I would argue of geek culture in general, really kind of broke it open, and then that led to a lot of other things. Then I published Resurrection right in February of 2022, right as the war is breaking out. So I talk a little bit about COVID and Resurrection. That was a big blow to the industry, and then now the war and the sanctions. It's a lot harder to have a Western-style comics convention in Moscow if nobody from the West wants to come to Russia anymore. And it's impossible to pay them. It's impossible to really organize these things. So it's really been a pretty severe blow. That again, so we're kind of back where we were, I guess, sometime in the early 2000s, where there's just a lot of wonderful people still doing work, posting it online, and still a few publications coming out. But in terms of a really viable comics industry, it's gone backwards. But so again, you could read my book and already have basically a kind of relic of how times were.
Oh, you're being too hard on yourself. I mean, this is a great document, and a lot of it's still relevant. I think like I was saying, I think it's a model for other academics to pursue exploring how other countries do comics. Especially, I love the article on the museum show, which allows the person to take a pause and see where are we headed, because you do cite a lot of cartoonists in here, and that's always such a great opportunity to reassess and assess what's going on, have whatever's going around in the last 10 years or so in a museum setting.
Yeah, well, again, I think both my books about Russian comics reflect the fact that I have, a background as a journalist. So these folks, a lot of them are still alive, so it's great to be able to talk to them. And for the first book, I was going to Russia twice a year, some years, going to the festivals, getting to know a lot of those, because that's when stuff started really happening, right? And like the Comisia Comics Festival and its co-founder, Hihus, And so kind of hanging out with them and getting to understand them a little bit better and interviewing them. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. Sadly, he who's passed away in 2018, a lot of those folks, some of them have left Russia because a lot of people have left Russia. It's just not a friendly environment. That's another reason why the Russian comics industry is kind of decimated. And so it's just a very different time. I don't know, my good friend Elliot says that that this is eventually going to be a trilogy, and that maybe I'll write the next part in retirement sometime. But we're going to have to let a lot of time pass because I don't know, I hope that maybe I will write it in some era when Putin is gone, and hopefully what has replaced him is not worse than him. You have to maintain some hope that Russia can maybe pull back from the brink, but I don't know. I think it's going to be really it's a pretty apocalyptic time. There are no easy answers, and Russian transitions of power have often not been peaceful or sedate affairs.
Well, let's turn back the clock to I just wanted you to make some observations about, okay, you're this young guy, you don't want to leave Russia, and you're working for the Moscow Tribune. You're a arts and lifestyle journalist. You've got your comic strip in the Moscow Tribune. How did that feel? What was that like?
Oh wow. Well, I was, we all can look back and think about our mid-20s, and everything is kind of wide open, and there's so many things that you're just sucking up. I decided we must be about the same age, right? I'm 55.
Yeah. You're what?
55.
Yeah, we are.
So, that whole Gen X slacker thing. And I decided pretty early on that I was not going to stay in Austin. I mean, Austin's a great place, but we always called it the fishbowl because you could kind of basically swim around and have a lot of fun. And it's a wonderful place, though it's changed a lot. But Austin in the 80s and 90s was a pretty cool place. But I know I didn't want to stay there. I mean, a lot of my friends were just kind of going to stay there after graduation. And that, well, there's more to do. I've got this background with Russian studies. I want to go to Russia. So even if I'm going to be washing dishes or just doing manual labors, I mean, at least I'll be doing it in Russia. And so that was my basically ticket out of there. And then, as you point out, I did my last semester at study abroad there, and then I just stayed. I actually lived illegally in the dorm for a few months till I was kicked out. And I was, I guess, borderline homeless. I was kind of couch surfing, and by then I had gotten the job at the Moscow Tribune, so I actually slept in their offices for a while. So it was a pretty freewheeling kind of vagabondy kind of time. And Moscow in the 90s was the most fascinating place, in the world, I would think, because the wall had just come down. It was, even though there was already a lot of human suffering and economic turmoil, there was still hope and optimism that maybe the democratic and capitalist experiment would pay off. And so people were still they were very curious about Americans. They were always inviting us, me and the other students, and then later just me, because I was the only one that stayed. And just talking about every aspect of American life. What how much does college cost? Does every American have a gun? All of these different things, and they were all just really, really, wanting to know, right, what it was like to live as an American after so many years of Soviet propaganda. Yes, and then there were these new ventures. I was an arts reporter, right? So I would cover the Moscow Film Festival, which was awesome, and you get people from all over the world. I got to interview Werner Herzog, one of my first interviews. That was a cool interview. And then I got to interview Wim Wenders. I got to interview just a lot of people all over, and then just the Russian artists, and then just meeting comics artists, right? Because that was when the beginnings of the project began. Was, well, there's no real comics industry that I can see, right? There's music television, there's skateboarding, there's video games, there's all of these Western media that the Russians have taken up, but not really many comics. There were very few translations of Spider-Man or Mickey Mouse. the occasional little self-printed thing, but it was also just very hard because it was actually just hard to get to a copy machine. In the Soviet period, things like copy machines and computers, they were all registered with the state, so you couldn't just, there were no like Kinkos or anything. So and even in the 90s, it was kind of a hassle to get they wouldn't let you yourself make the copies. You have to give it to them and give them instructions, and so it was just not as easy. So there was not that kind of zine culture that as we understand it over here. It took a lot longer for that to happen. And anyway, so it was all of that stuff, right? So really, Moscow Calling is the distillation of a lot of that that sense. And in a way, the trajectory of the storyline, which was very open-ended, I didn't really have any particular kind of, beginning, middle, and end, as I sort of did in the Phantom Zone. It was you can see how it kind of mirrors my own journey, because at the beginning it's talking about Pepe and his interactions with Cersei, who is a holdover student character from the Phantom Zone, and so kind of getting all of that. Then those characters were all basically dropped. The American characters kind of disappear, and then it becomes a lot more about these new Russian characters and Pepe's Russian adventures. And that's basically what happened to me, right? Is that, yes, originally I was hanging out with all my fellow classmates, and then they all went back home, and I stayed, and then I had a whole bunch of other adventures. So it was a wonderful time. Of course, the other big highlight is the October 1993 mini civil war that broke out in Moscow between Yeltsin and his very recalcitrant parliament, which was kind of wanting to turn back the clock, and how he ends up well, he didn't have to do this, but he did. He bombs the parliament building called the White House, and that was it was fascinating actually looking at that how people responded to that, because I think many of us who were Westerners, and of course I was covering this for the newspaper, we saw that as kind of a necessary move on Yeltsin's part, because they were shooting people and they had started riots and there was real disorder, and you needed to kind of shut that down. On the other hand, a lot of my Russian friends said that was the moment where they turned against the reforms, where they saw that Yeltsin was just a tyrant, and that he was willing to bomb his own parliament and to bring in tanks, and that was too much for some people, and they thought that democracy was going to be the equivalent of chaos. That was all it was. There's a pun in Russian. The Russian word for democracy is demokratia, but it happens to sound a little bit, the beginning of the word sounds like dermokratia. So dermo means crap or turd. So it's like crapocracy or shitocracy. And so instead of saying demokratia, people started saying dermokratia. And so
wow.
it's the beginnings really of what would end up kind of what we have today, is that for many Russians, democracy is a dirty word. It just basically means a veil over powerful people who are controlling you, and it basically means disorder. So it's much better to just have a strong hand to rule you and to make all of the decisions, and you just enjoy your life and your standard of living, which is growing, and you let all of those weirdos like gay people or people who are not really patriotic Russians, they don't really care what happens to them, and if they suffer, that's okay. They're all just agents of the West anyway. It's all very sad. But anyway, so yeah, it was the 90s that kind of where all of that stuff is beginning, but it's a very dynamic time.
Well, your last comments are very relevant to today. Empathy on top of cynicism. So you give a window into how Putin holds on to power, because not everyone's against him. People are like resigned to it, or they rationalized it.
Yes. And in Moscow Calling, it was I get into this in the interview with Elliot, but it's in a way, Kolya, Pepe's best friend, who ends up betraying him, falls into that kind of rabbit hole where he is reacting against things like the bombing of the parliament, where he is seeing that Russia is humiliated and weak, and he sees it as basically a global conspiracy to bring down the country, and he reacts against it. So he's anticipating what Putin is. And there's that splash page. Maybe you can show it, but there's that splash page that shows Kolya basically kind of looking up to this imaginary ruler who is going to bring Russia back to glory, and it's basically a portrait of Putin. I mean, so it was kind of a hard thing just in terms of the writing, because Kolya, even though I give little clues here and there that Kolya maybe is not completely with Pepe's program, it's meant to be kind of a shocking turnaround. It's meant to be like this whole unveiling. You know, like sometimes, I don't know, like I've had encounters like this with people that I talk to, and I don't know, they end up having really disgusting or revolting attitudes that you hadn't realized until, you know, you sitting together with them over a beer or something. And it's you know, I guess it's happened enough times that I think that I hope I made it more or less plausible. Certainly in that environment of the 90s and the stresses and the real sense of victimization that a lot of these people had, especially the more traditionally minded Russians, that I hope that it seems, you know, plausible.
Well, I think that might be a really good place to start wrapping things up. I want to make sure, is there something that that you wanted to cover, and anything that comes to mind that I somehow missed?
Well, no, I just wanted to thank you for your interest in the material, and your comics grinder review of the Phantom Zone was very appreciated, and I'm glad that you know, there's somebody out there who reads it as carefully as you do, and I appreciate that. I think Moscow Calling is a bit of a harder nut to crack for many readers, because unlike the Phantom Zone, right, it's happening in another country at another time. It's a very different era than Russia today. I think in ways that we've touched on in today, it's necessary to talk about the roots of Putinism and to talk about why Russians, a lot of them, feel the way that they do. If my book can, you know, hopefully contribute a little bit to those conversations. The other thing is that it's just, I think it's a fairly fun document of life at that time, and maybe a little bit of self-reflection, because Pepe is a fairly inoffensive, kind of nice character, but he was also the beneficiary of a lot of privilege as an American, even as a Mexican American. He's being rescued all the time by people. He's being sheltered. He's kind of able to live this sort of fantasy of being a Russian mafioso at a certain time, and to try to you know, shut down smoking in Moscow through an anti-smoking campaign. All of these kind of ridiculous things that he's trying to do, but there's no real consequences until the end, until the conclusion, where all of those things come home to roost, and where Pepe is faced with the very real and sobering reality of what Russians are really going through in the 90s. And it, you know, he has to, it almost, and that's what makes him leave. So Elliot points out that that there's a number of that my stories tend to follow a pattern. The same thing happened with Chip in the Phantom Zone, is where you have a character kind of in their own head, kind of doing their own thing, and not really hurting anybody, but just a little bit clueless to the world around them, and then they are very violently brought to reality, and that kind of happens in both of these books. In the Phantom Zone, unfortunately, right, Chip dies as a result of that. And here, Pepe's bacon is saved. There is, let me just say one more thing. There, I do mean to continue this story. There is the character of Pepe's sister, Cassie, who makes a couple of cameo appearances. I want to do this would probably be a graphic novel that is very episodic, but basically telling the story of Cassie's life in Russia. Cassie's a very different character from Pepe. For one thing, she's trained as a doctor, and she's working for a group related to Doctors Without Borders. but I wanted to follow her as she stays in Russia and as she kind of goes through basically as she goes and lives on into the Putin era, and she winds up in Mariupol. So the one story about the Ukraine war that I do put into this collection has Cassie in Ukraine already. But so I want to fill in what happens between the 90s and her winding up in Ukraine. And that would be called Cassie's Turn, which would be its own self-contained graphic novel, where I'm kind of basically trying to tell the story of what happened to Russia through Cassie's eyes.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
Thank you. I hope you can read it and we can talk about it.
Oh, you bet. I am working on a separate review of Compleat Moscow Calling. So that will be going up, and then subsequently your interview. So I've got a whole bunch of projects, but I have to focus, and this is one that's on the front burner. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you so much for your support. Yeah.
Oh, you bet. You bet. Well, thanks so
Let
much.
me know if you're ever coming to Seattle again.
Yes, I will. I might be later this year, but I'll let folks know.
Yeah, I mean, and I do go to the DC area, once every couple of years. Are you anywhere near there?
Yes, very, very close. It's
Okay.
like you get on the plane and all of a sudden you're there. It's like it's so quick. Like about half an hour, 40 minutes, and you're there.
I guess so. Yeah, I guess you and David must have that Virginia connection.
Yes, yeah. Actually, I was born in Richmond, Virginia, but I wasn't raised in Richmond. I was just born there, and then we moved to Texas, of all places.
Wow,
So I'm very
wow.
familiar with Texas.
Cool. Well, I definitely want to get to Richmond because I'm a big Edgar Allan Poe fan, and
Oh,
I never visited. They got the museum there, and he lived there. And Poe was actually the first writer that I remember reading as a little kid, thinking, "Whoa, this is not for children. This
yeah,
is something different." It was a real kind of a breakthrough for me. And then I read a little like kid's biography of him. I remember as a very young child, and just loved just reading about Richmond, reading about Baltimore, and reading about his life. Yeah, I'm a huge Poe fan, and they've got a big thing about a Poe festival in Baltimore, but I know also in Richmond they've got that, so I'd love to go to that sometime. Yeah, well, let me know whenever you're
yeah.
coming to Seattle.
Oh, sure. I think our paths will eventually cross.
Yeah, one more thing I was going to
Yeah.
ask: did you know you must have known Mark Campos?
Yes, I didn't get to know him really well, but yes, I did know him.
Yeah, well, so I think he's another figure that we would have in common. As you know, I dedicated the Phantom Zone to him because he was a really important part of the Seattle comics community, and it was really because of the Seattle comics community and its very strong supporting kind of network that really reignited my comics practice after basically lying dormant for 20 years while I was having a career.
Well,
So yeah.
if you wanted to say 2 or 3 words about Dune, I know that was a significant part of comics history in Seattle and anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. No, Dune was extremely important for me and for many people just to be able to get together in a very friendly, supportive social setting and see what other people are doing and work on something for a few hours and then have it come out as an actual product, an actual collection, a zine. So yeah, there would be no I don't think I would have gotten back into my comics, sadly, without that very supportive network. And Mark Campos was the heart of it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Jose, thank you so much.